to take a step back and remind ourselves where we're going, we spoke about how really there's this essential battle between the Jewish approach and the Greek approach. The Greek approach is focused on the Chama. The Chama is the element of the sun that is the results of the sun, while the Shemesh would be the actual sun. And when you have the perspective of worshiping the Chama, a person gets to the point where they're focusing completely on the results as opposed to on the essence. They appreciate the pleasures of the world as opposed to the purpose of the world. That's a big difference. A very big difference between the two of them. And the approach of focusing on the pleasures of the world leads a person further and further into immorality and decadence, whereas the approach on focusing onto the essence and the purpose of the world and the actual creation, recognizing where creation comes from instead of the tertiary results, brings a person to humility and to recognizing their place. And of course, on Thanksgiving, it brings a person to recognizing the goodness that we have. And that itself is, of course, a whole different way of living life. And that's the reason why we said that the battle is juxtaposed one versus the other, that Antiochus and all of his armies and all of their great armies ran away as a result of Matisyahu's faith in God, because his faith in God was the recognition that I need to put my effort in and God will fill the rest of it, but that's where we're coming from. And we pointed out that for ourselves, we need to realize that even within ourselves, we sometimes neglect this idea by thinking that our livelihood is providing our life, when in fact it's God that's providing our livelihood, and the job that we have is just a mechanism in order to be able to get the things that we need. And so when we remind ourselves not to prostrate, so to speak, to the idol of the Chama, in other words, not to lower our intellect, not to bow down into obeisance and that kind of thing, to realize that, you know what, my life is my Judaism and my job is the way in which I can live my life, but it's the way in which God gives me the blessings that I have. And then a person is able to have that fuller perspective and, of course, the deeper element of life. And that's really what serving God is all about. So now the Rebbe goes into a second element of this whole difference in philosophy. And this one's very, very interesting, because in Hasidic texts, you have the idea that the Greeks were, of course, intellectuals. They were philosophers. And so therefore, ultimately, it was not just about idolatry, but there was also about a philosophical element of this. It was not just about hedonism versus humility and those kinds of things that we've discussed before, but also it goes into the theological / philosophical world. And that's what we're going to explore right now, which again extends into today's world in terms of where we see that the world has brought us. And I want to give a little bit of a preface by saying that the Rebbe is going to knock at the secular sciences, but I do not want anybody to think that we're being anti-science in any way. We are reflecting the Jewish approach to the study of sciences versus the secular approach to the study of sciences. And the Rebbe is going to be very clear about what's the difference between the two of them. But it's important to remember that the Rebbe himself studied under Nobel Prize winners. He was he was involved in the sciences. He was very, very actively involved in pushing Jewish scientists to take the traditional approach and responding to people's questions about the balances between faith and science and that kind of thing. The Rebbe did not see it as a contradiction whatsoever. There are, of course, differences, and those are the differences that we're going to look at. And that's where we start in chapter 5. The spiritual war between the Maccabees and the Greeks even extends into the intellectual realm. Mishlei states, the lips of the wise spread knowledge, but not so the heart of fools. If you go through Mishlei, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, Mishlei and Kohelet, you have these quotes, and these quotes are all over the place, and it's very difficult to read straight up. They sound really nice in terms of quotable quotes, but he seems like he's repeating himself, and they're very difficult to understand exactly what he's leaning into. And here's one of these cases, which basically sounds nice. The lips of the wise spread knowledge, but not so the heart of fools. What does that mean? So the Midrash expounds on this verse. The lips of the wise of the Jewish people, and the heart of fools refers to the heretics who say that the world is a spontaneous creation. So it's very interesting because basically the whole philosophy behind the Big Bang Theory and some of the other theories that we have today that are really promulgated as the prime theories of creation, they're not new. They're very old. The Midrash was talking about spontaneous creation. Obviously, in those days, they were talking about these same ideas. So God responds to them, I created the world with the words, it will be, and you say, not so. Okay? And then the Midrash goes on to denote that the wicked cause divisiveness in the world as a result of their approach. So I say it will be, and you say not so. God says, Vayichen, and the wicked say, Lochen. To explain, the heart of fools refers to secular wisdom. Why do the sages apply the terms heart and foolish in this context? The Rebbe says the secular world undoubtedly has wisdom in the sciences and philosophy. The Greek were renowned for their wisdom, but using the analogy of oil in place of wisdom that we find in Kabbalistic texts, they defiled the oil. So they took wisdom and they defiled it. Oil is used as an analogy for wisdom because of the fact that it's found in an olive, and the olive needs to be crushed to be able to find out what the essence is. So wisdom is likewise the process of going through an intensive process to be able to really, truly get the essence of something, not just what you see at surface level. So the Greeks did that, but they did it in such a way of timu hashmanim, they defiled the oil. The Greeks had wisdom, but their secular treatment of it made it into foolishness. It was regarding the difference between their approach and the approach of Judaism that King Shlomo said, and I saw that wisdom excels over foolishness. Okay? Are we just going to trash them without giving them their due? So the Rebbe says, what then is the difference between holy wisdom and secular wisdom? Why is one wisdom and the other intellectual as it is called foolishness? And so now we kind of bring this back into what we were talking about before. The Rebbe says something very, very interesting. The difference between the two studies is this. Holy and godly wisdom causes self-nullification, while secular philosophy causes the expansion of ego and divisiveness. I had a teacher in high school, was a science teacher, and we were talking to him about one thing or the other, and somehow we got around to asking him, as a scientist, what's your interest? He goes, well, the point is to be able to come up with a new theory to prove it, and then you become famous. Something's named after you. That's the point of it. And even at the time, that obviously struck me as wrong. And again, we're not saying that all scientists are like this. There's an approach that is a different approach. There's one approach in which the focus is on me, my theories, my ideas, and I'm going to defend my ideas to the death because of the fact that they're mine. And the other one is focused on God. You can be a scientist whose interest in science is godliness. You can be a scientist whose interest is not in oneself. Its interest is like, for example, Dr. Jonas Salk is the classic example as one of the innovators of the polio vaccine. He refused to make money off of it because they said the reason why he did this was for humanity. So humanity should own the rights to something like this. He recognized it's not about me, it's about my responsibility to people around myself. So you can be a godly scientist, but is the approach one of focus on oneself, or is the approach one of focus on God? And the Rebbe continues and says, the reason for this is in the subject matter. Holy theological study discusses how creation is from a state of nothingness. Even after all was created, this nothingness, the unexplained mystery of God's creative energy, must constantly remain within all of creation to keep it in a state of being and give it life. So since from that perspective, all of creation is a continuous result of the godly mystery of nothing, therefore, the study of this wisdom causes self-nullification, causes humility, not just in the intellect, but even in the emotions, despite the fact the emotion, as opposed to intellect, are given to naturally expressing themselves outwards. So when somebody is truly focused in their study of Judaism and their study of godliness, and I would dare to say even in their focus on their scientific pursuits or philosophical pursuits, and they're doing it within a recognition of God's creation, within a recognition of the fact that God supports the world on a constant basis and brings the world from a state of nothing into a state of something. When somebody has that kind of attitude, then it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with God. And so such a person can't be full of themselves, because they'd be a fool to be thinking that they're full of themselves, because it's not about that. They were given access, they were given life, they were given the ability. And so therefore, recognizing all that when that is at the core of your beliefs brings a person to a point where whatever you gain is not about you. Whatever you toil for and whatever you go to, it's not about you. This, of course, can be true, like we said, of scientists. And the opposite can be true of Torah scholars as well. Somebody can be religious but have a secular outlook towards their Judaism and be on the side of the foolish that we're talking about. Now, the second thing that he talks about is that basically intellect informs the emotion. When we think about something, we get excited about it, we're energized about it, we react in certain ways to it. So the emotions are naturally self-aware and expressing themselves towards somebody else. But when somebody comes from this perspective and they absorb that into their life, then their approach towards anything, even their emotional approach towards something, includes this level of humility, because that's where they're coming from, because that's the essence of their entire approach. But secular wisdom focuses on existence only once it has been created. The purpose of this wisdom is to clarify the details of reality already in existence. And since its focus is solely on matters within the realm of tangible reality, therefore it magnifies the existence and selfness found within not just the emotions, but even the intellect itself. I found this particular property of physics. I was the founder of this doctrine. I was the inventor of this methodology. I found it. It's about me. And because it's about me taking physicality and trying to focus on the details found within the world, and that's what the primary focus is on, the details in the world, and immersing oneself in those details and ignoring God's existence. So therefore, it's all about me and details. And when somebody disagrees with my theories, then I come completely against them. Personally. So the result is not only does it exacerbate the feeling of self typically found within emotions, but it even adds ego to them, which results in negative emotions. And this is how you find some of the greatest scholars in the worlds of the sciences or philosophy with the most vile character traits. Aristotle wrote about the most pleasurable intimate experiences were with children. So Aristotle, on the one hand, of course, is one of the founders of Western thought, but obviously, being a pedophile, that's not exactly something that's very pleasant.
Abhorrent for me.
What was that?
It's abhorrent.
Yes,
the thought of
it absolutely.
Yeah,
it absolutely is, and it's well known. Some of the greatest of scientists who are shall we say, straight up adulterers and all that kind of thing. And such a thing in Judaism is abhorrent. It's a perfect word to it, to the greatest degree. But since these people look at the world as being purely physical, and since they define human beings as nothing more than an animal, why should there be such a big deal about one human being mating with another human being if they're not married? Does it make a difference? From a purely rational perspective, there's no difference. Animals do it all the time. And they're proud of it. You watch nature documentaries. My wife and I have watched many nature documentaries. And I remember seeing how, one of these documentaries, they were so excited about reporting how they thought that sparrows mate for life, but they caught a sparrow having a fling with a female sparrow having flings with several other male sparrows. And they're reporting about this like, you see. And it's like, well, no kidding, it's an animal. And if a human being wants to act like an animal, a human being has the prerogative to do so. But the fact is, that's not who we are. We have the capability of being godly. And for that, we need to exhibit self-control. There are some animals that are, theoretically at least, completely monogamous for life, and that's wonderful. The Talmud says you can learn certain things from certain animals. We can certainly learn certain things, but we recognize that that's their nature. These things are their nature, and it's not about their choice. We have choices. So going back to what the Rebbe says about some of these scientists, and again, the Rebbe studied under some of these people, and I've seen where the Rebbe actually describes some of these people. And the Rebbe points out, the Rebbe, again, he had, I think, 3 or 4 Nobel Prize winners who were his teachers in the University of Berlin and the Sorbonne. So he says the wisdom does not help them in their human personal life. And it is for that reason that the sages refer to such people as the heart of fools. Their emotions have been allowed to run amok, and their wisdom results in foolish conclusions, such as the world is the result of a spontaneous happenstance. I had a conversation with a researcher many years ago. He was talking about the research that he did for cancer. And I asked him, I said, what are the different, how do you do such research? What do you do? And he started speaking about different theories and different processes that people do. And, talking about on the molecular level, on the chromosomal level, and it's really fascinating. And so hearing that, I'm like, how do people not believe in God when you're hearing about the intensity of the systems that work within ourselves and within the DNA of the world? It's just mind-blowing how complex things are. How do people not believe in God? How do scientists say that there is no God when it is so beautiful and so complex and so incredible, and and we're constantly trying to draw and figure pieces out? He said, I think the difference is that oftentimes scientists are so focused in their lane, they see nothing outside of it. They completely focus on their particular type of science. They don't look at the bigger picture. And so therefore, at the end of the day, they're basically the same thing as mechanics. The mechanic is focused on fixing the car, and he's not particularly interested in the other things outside of him. Likewise, with the researchers, they're not necessarily focused on the beauty and the complexity and things that are completely beyond that bigger picture. Doesn't concern them oftentimes because they're overwhelmed by it and they don't want to think about it. And it's much easier to be able to focus just on in their lane. That was his theory. But of course, when you do start thinking about things, you realize that everything is so incredibly intertwined and it was so incredibly complex. Of course, there has to be something controlling it. And that something controlling it, when you consider that is something that's constant, it's not that God just created the world and let things run its course. Because when things run their course, they run into chaos. The nature itself is to degrade. And we don't see that. Things continuously, systematically keep moving. And the Rebbe says, on the other hand, as we explained, godly wisdom brings unity and humility as it brings the scholar closer and closer to the recognition of his insignificance in the godly mystery of nothing. Therefore, the verse uses the term yizoru, the wisdom of knowledge, sages spread knowledge. And Rashi tells us that this word is related to the word nezar, which means a crown. And in the soul, the level of the crown, the keter, refers to the intangible element of the soul's faith in God. You can draw logical conclusions, but there's always a point which is the mystery of beyond, and that is faith. So the new, deeper meaning of this verse is, with the power of faith, a person is capable of transcending even that which they cannot understand. His lack of understanding does not weaken his faith. He recognizes that no thought can grasp God, not even the highest levels of intellect, in Atzilut and even higher, and therefore it is no surprise that puny human intellect cannot grasp everything. On the other hand, if you take the human, the secular approach to everything, well, we scientists, we know everything. We can predict what will happen in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And we are predicting, and we're making absolute statements. And you have doctors who do this as well. Doctors who make absolute statements. You have 6 months to live. You have this, you have the other thing. As opposed to saying, well, the information that we have leads us to presuming this information because of a person's humility. So the Rebbe concludes, this then is how Matityahu and his children were able to overcome the vast legions of sun-worshipping Greeks with their power of faith. Likewise, in our spiritual battle, we must not succumb to the perspective of the world that divides everything into multitudes and disconnected details. We do this by strengthening our own faith in God. When we take the soul approach to things, when we take the godly approach to things, and like I said, you can be a religious Jew and lose sight of the same idea. It's important to remember that. We're not saying that, okay, dividing everybody into the world, us and them. We have to, within ourselves, recognize and come to terms with the godly approach. And then when you look out at the world, you don't see things in terms of black and white. You don't see things in terms of us and them. You see things in terms of the godly perspective. I, as a Jew, have a certain responsibility, not because I'm better, because God gave it to me. God chose me to do this. What do I feel as a result of that? Humility. God could have just as easily chosen a different nation. He didn't. He chose this nation and he chose me in it. And so that humility brings us to an appreciation and, of course, a pride in the fact that we were chosen. But it doesn't mean to put other people down. It doesn't mean to create greater and greater divisiveness. It is true that sometimes we have to stand up for ourselves and sometimes we have to even fight and wage battles and all that kind of thing. But that's coming from a perspective of, this is my responsibility. It's not coming from an element of divisiveness. Because if it was coming from divisiveness, then the approach would be to basically to constantly wage wars. And as we know, that's not the approach in Judaism. The approach in Judaism is to say, okay, this is what we need to do. These are the parameters. Let us do it in peace and let us keep going. So getting back to what we're saying here in terms of this idea, recognizing that the secular approach to the sciences and to philosophy is about differences and divisiveness and details, and therefore it erodes the sense of responsibility, it erodes the sense of purpose, whereas the Jewish approach is on, so to speak, nothingness, the mystery, the godly mystery of nothingness and ultimate purpose. And that is where we're heading to. Willing, we'll finish off this mimer tomorrow. And then we will, any questions, because I know this is larger idea, but God willing, tomorrow we'll be able to answer any further questions that I have. A wonderful, wonderful day. And of course, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you very much. Same to you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good luck.
Pleasure.